The gunshot ripped through the quiet of the street, so sudden, so violent, that for a moment time itself seemed to splinter. Screams burst out from every direction, high-pitched, panicked, fractured cries that carried the weight of disbelief. A body fell, and the sound of it hitting the pavement was drowned beneath the gasps of neighbors rushing from their homes, eyes wide with horror, hands clutching at their mouths as if to stop the truth from entering. Some said it was Emily who collapsed, others swore it was Sarah, or maybe Rebecca. The names shifted with every retelling, blurred in the confusion of blood and shock. What no one doubted was the raw, undeniable fact. A daughter had been shot. The scene was chaos disguised as suburbia. Sprinklers still ticked rhythmically on manicured lawns. Birds continued their morning chatter, and yet the ground seemed painted in terror. One neighbor, trembling, tried to describe what she saw. The girl was just standing there singing, and then her words dissolved into sobs, replaced by another voice insisting it wasn't the same girl at all, that it was someone else entirely, that memory was betraying them all in real time. Names blurred, faces distorted, but the horror remained fixed like a stain that would not wash away. Parents stumbled forward, tripping over garden hoses, sprinting across driveways, calling names that changed in the air. Emily! One shouted, but the echo was countered by another's Sarah, and then another's Rebecca, as though the neighborhood itself had lost the certainty of identity. Every scream carried desperation, every cry carried confusion. The only constant was the sight of a young girl, whoever she was, clutching her chest, her voice silenced mid-song, as the echo of the gunfire still seemed to hang above the cul-de-sac like smoke. The shooter's shadow lingered on the edge of every account. Some swore they saw a figure with wild eyes and clenched fists. Others whispered that it was Karen, though in hushed tones they called her Linda or Deborah or Cheryl, as if speaking her true name aloud would summon her again. The name was fluid, ever-changing, but the threat was permanent. A woman with fury etched into her bones had crossed the line between words and violence. What had been bitter complaints, petty arguments, letters slipped under doors, had erupted into something irreversible. Neighbors argued even as they tried to help. One insisted it was an accident, that the gun wasn't meant to fire. Another spat back that there was nothing accidental in the way she raised it, nothing unintentional in the way she aimed. The quarrels tangled with the cries of grief, and all the while the girl, Emily or Sarah or Rebecca, lay bleeding into the cracks of a driveway that only yesterday had been washed clean. Sirens wailed in the distance, still too far away, swallowed by the frantic pulse of the moment. A mother's wail broke through the clamor, a sound too raw for words, too jagged for reason. Fathers stood frozen, helpless, fists clenched in impotent rage. Children peeked from behind curtains, wide-eyed, their world of school buses and ice cream trucks forever shattered. The gunshot had not just torn through flesh, it had fractured the illusion of safety, ripped apart the quiet fantasy of suburban peace. And the question burned in every heart, gnawed at every mind, refused to let go. How could this happen here? How could a simple song, sung by a child with the innocence of joy, transform into the spark for bloodshed? How did a voice meant to bring life and melody summon death instead? The answer was buried beneath layers of fear, rage, and silence. Some would call it madness. Others would call it malice. But in that moment, as the girl's body trembled on the concrete and her song was stolen mid-note, the neighborhood understood only one thing. The story of that gunshot would haunt them forever. How did a simple song turn into a nightmare? Before that fateful morning, the days were quiet, predictable, the hum of suburban life. Birds chirped in the trees outside the kitchen window, a constant reminder of the simple joys in this little corner of the world. The sun always seemed to rise at the right time, casting a gentle glow over everything. Even the sidewalk, cracked in places, had a sort of charm to it, as if it was a part of the family. Emily, no, it was Sarah that morning, or maybe it was Rebecca, had the kind of voice that could soften the hardest heart. On this particular morning, she was humming a tune from one of her favorite songs, a soft melody that echoed across the house. It was always the same: her voice, the sound of her footsteps across the living room, and the distant hum of the refrigerator. In the kitchen, her mother, Lila, was standing over a cup of coffee, glancing over her phone, and, as usual, scrolling through the notifications that seemed to pile up faster than she could read them. The routine was familiar, comforting. Sarah, or was it Emily, had just finished one of her usual singing sessions, walking around the house, jumping between songs like a bird shifting from branch to branch. Her voice had become the soundtrack of their home. Lila could hardly remember a day when Sarah wasn't singing. It was the heart of their home, the voice that filled the empty spaces. At first, she thought it was the stage of growing up, one of those annoying things parents had to endure. But then it became something more. It became an essential rhythm. Each note was a thread in the fabric of their lives, weaving them closer. "You know, I could have sworn you were singing a little louder today," Lila would joke, but the pride in her eyes was clear. She didn't mind. She never did. The peace, the innocence, was palpable in every corner. Sarah's voice wasn't just loud, it was full of life, full of promise. It wasn't just a voice, it was a beacon of hope, a reminder of who they were and what they had. The songs didn't demand attention, they simply needed to be heard. They floated out into the open air, blending with the soft rustle of the leaves and the occasional chirp of a sparrow. Every corner of the house had been touched by it. But, as with all things that seemed too perfect, there were cracks. They were subtle at first, whispers of unease that crept in slowly. At the time, Lila didn't think much of them. After all, every neighborhood had its quirks, and every block had its share of characters. The neighborhood was a place of pride, a community that held tightly to its traditions. It was the sort of place where families gathered for barbecues, children played in the yards, and the HOA, Homeowners Association, was revered as the silent protector of order. But, as Lila had soon discovered, the HOA's definition of order was far from peaceful. It started with Karen, or maybe it was Linda that day. Names in the neighborhood, like memories, blurred and shifted. Karen was the one who stood at the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn with a disapproving frown, clutching a clipboard like a weapon, her eyes narrowed in judgment. It wasn't the first time Lila had noticed her. They'd exchanged pleasantries at neighborhood gatherings, but Karen's words always seemed to carry an edge. She had that air about her, the one that suggested she knew better than everyone else, and she wasn't afraid to make sure you knew it too. "Your daughter," Karen had said one morning, a thin smile playing at the edge of her lips, "she sings a little too loudly, doesn't she?" Lila, who had always prided herself on her ability to navigate awkward conversations with grace, had simply smiled back, nodding in the way she thought was polite. "It's just a phase," she had said, almost apologetically, but Karen had pressed on, as if her words were law. "Well, it's really not. The HOA's rules are very clear, Lila. Noise levels, especially between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m., are something we take seriously here." Lila had been taken aback. The HOA? Since when did they care about her daughter's singing? But it wasn't the first time Karen had made an issue out of something trivial. The neighborhood was pristine, yes, everything in its place, just so. But Lila had always assumed that the HOA was about maintaining the aesthetic, the lawns, the driveways. Now, she realized that it was about control. At first, it was an occasional mention, a passive-aggressive comment here and there. Every time Sarah sang, Karen, or was it Linda? Who could tell now? Was there with her clipboard, making notes, shaking her head in disapproval. There was always something about the volume, the time of day, the fact that the wind carried the sound too far. It wasn't a question of whether Sarah could sing, it was about when and how. Lila had dismissed it for a while, chalking it up to neighborhood politics. The kind of petty things people found to complain about when they didn't have anything else to occupy their time. But then came the letter, an official notification from the HOA, signed by someone who had too much time on their hands. The letter was polite, but the message was clear. Sarah's singing was no longer a phase. It was a problem, a loud problem, one that disturbed the peace and order that the HOA held sacred. For the first time, Lila felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Was she supposed to muzzle her daughter's joy, her spirit? Was she supposed to tell her that her singing was too much, that the voice which filled their home with laughter and warmth was an inconvenience? Maybe we should just tone it down a little, Lila suggested one night after dinner, trying to soften the blow. But Sarah, or maybe it was Emily, just shook her head, her eyes wide with disbelief. Why should I? She had asked. It's my voice. I'm not hurting anyone. And she wasn't. But what good was logic in a place where neighbors kept track of every sound, every misstep? The HOA was more than just an organization. It was a silent presence, watching from behind windows, waiting for the smallest misstep. And every complaint felt unreasonable, too small, too petty, yet too powerful to ignore. Lila had to smile and nod to pretend it was just another quirk of suburban life. But deep down, she felt the change in the air, a change that wasn't so subtle anymore. This wasn't just about singing. It was about control. And Karen, no, Linda, had just thrown down the gauntlet. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in the neighborhood began to stretch like a taut wire ready to snap. The HOA, once an entity that seemed distant, now hovered over their lives like a shadow, ever present, ever watchful. Lila could feel it in the way her neighbors glanced at her, in the way her daughter's voice seemed to carry more weight than it ever had before. What was once a simple joy became a source of dread. Every note Sarah, or was it Emily, sang was now a potential target, a reason for the complaints that were slowly but surely piling up. At first, Lila tried to ignore it. She reassured Sarah every time they came home to another letter from the HOA, their neatly typed words dripping with passive aggression, excessive noise, disturbing the peace, complaints filed. They were like little arrows, each one hitting closer to the heart. But she couldn't protect her daughter from something she couldn't see. She couldn't shield her from the invisible barrier that was slowly closing in, squeezing the life out of the happiness they once took for granted. It wasn't just the letters. There was the phone call, too, the one Lila had received one evening while making dinner. A stern voice on the other end had introduced itself as one of the HOA representatives. Mrs. Andrews, the voice had said, I'm afraid we've had multiple complaints about your daughter's singing. I'm afraid the situation is escalating. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an accusation, a judgment. Escalating. Lila had repeated, the word hanging in the air between them. How? Well, the voice continued, it's reached the point where we've had to issue another warning. If this continues, we may have to consider taking further action. The tone was firm, unwavering. There was no empathy, no understanding, just an unrelenting demand for silence. Lila had felt her blood run cold. What further action? She thought. It wasn't like they were living in a music studio or throwing wild parties. It was just Sarah, or maybe Emily, singing in her own backyard, the way children should be allowed to. Why was it wrong for her to sing? She hung up the phone that evening, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just about singing. This was about silencing them, about controlling their space. It was as though the very essence of their home was under siege. In the days that followed, Sarah became more cautious. She'd step out into the yard, but her voice was softer now, careful, hesitant. Gone was the freedom she had once enjoyed, the joy of singing without thinking about who was listening. She'd glance nervously over her shoulder, checking to see if anyone was around to hear her. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Neighbors who once waved as they mowed their lawns now avoided eye contact, pretending not to notice the tension that hung in the air. Lila could feel her daughter's spirit dimming with every passing day. It wasn't just the HOA anymore. It was the effect it was having on Sarah's confidence. The bright, bubbly girl who once belted out tunes without a care in the world was now a shadow of her former self, retreating into herself. Every song felt like a battle. Every note she sang was like a small act of rebellion against a force that seemed unmovable. And then came the first confrontation. It was one of those mornings when Sarah, or was it Rebecca, hadn't let the complaints get to her. She stepped out into the yard, her voice clear and bold, filling the space with a song from her favorite musical. She was determined to sing, determined to fight back against the quiet oppression that had begun to creep into their lives. But Karen, no, it was definitely Linda this time, was waiting for her. Lila was in the kitchen when she heard the sharp, brittle sound of the front door slamming. She rushed outside, but by the time she got to the porch, she saw Sarah standing frozen in the yard, her face pale, her lips trembling. Across the street, Linda, no, Karen, was standing with her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Sarah like a hawk watching its prey. "What do you think you're doing?" Linda called, her voice cold and sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. "You've been warned." Sarah opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She was scared, and Lila could see it in her daughter's eyes. Sarah, or maybe Emily, had always been confident, always stood tall and unafraid. But now, her voice faltered, her words stuck in her throat. She wasn't just facing a neighbor, she was facing an entire system that wanted to control her, silence her. Lila stepped forward, her hands trembling. She had to do something. She couldn't let her daughter be silenced like this. "Enough," she said, her voice steady despite the storm swirling in her chest. "This is our home, Karen or Linda, or whatever you want to call yourself. My daughter has every right to sing here." The words felt foreign in her mouth. Her daughter has every right to sing here. It was a simple statement, but to say it out loud felt like an act of defiance, an act that might cost them everything. But Linda, no, Karen wasn't moved. "We have rules for a reason," she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. "The HOA has standards, and if you can't follow them, then there will be consequences." Her words hung in the air, heavy with threat. Lila opened her mouth to respond. But before she could say another word, the door slammed behind her. Sarah had already retreated into the house, her face pale, her shoulders slumped in defeat. It wasn't just the rules that were breaking them. It was the crushing weight of living under constant scrutiny, under the control of people who had nothing better to do than make others miserable. And as Lila watched Sarah disappear into the house, she felt a fire ignite deep inside her. This wasn't just a fight for her daughter's voice. It was a fight for their home, their lives, their right to exist without fear. But the worst part was yet to come. Because at that moment, Lila had no idea how far Karen or Linda was willing to go to get what she wanted. The days following the confrontation with Karen, or maybe Linda, felt like an endless string of battles. Every encounter, every glance exchanged with a neighbor, became a silent reminder of the unspoken war that had erupted in their once peaceful neighborhood. The light-hearted songs that had once filled their home now felt like acts of defiance, as if Sarah, or was it Emily, was pushing back against a force that was slowly swallowing everything she loved. It was hard to ignore the way things had changed. The neighborhood had shifted from a place of camaraderie to one of whispered judgments. Neighbors who used to wave from across the street now looked away when Lila and Sarah walked outside. There were no more spontaneous invitations for barbecues or potluck dinners. The once friendly faces of people who had lived in the same community for years were now strangers, their eyes filled with silent reproach. It was as though every smile, every pleasantry had been drained of its sincerity. The HOA's warnings escalated, each letter more official, more threatening. Each envelope that arrived at the doorstep seemed to carry with it a weight that pressed down on Lila's chest. Violation of HOA noise policy, the letters would read. Immediate action required. It wasn't just about Sarah's singing anymore. It was about control, about making them bend to the rules of a system that had no interest in their happiness, only in their conformity. Sarah, or maybe Emily, had stopped singing altogether. The girl who once filled their home with melodies now sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the floor, her spirit slowly withering away. The joy she once took in singing had been replaced with fear, fear of what would happen next. Her bright voice, once so full of promise, had been silenced, not by the laws of the HOA, but by the crushing weight of their unrelenting judgment. Lila couldn't stand it. She couldn't watch her daughter, her bright, vibrant daughter, slowly shrink into herself. Every time she looked at Sarah, she saw the fire that had once burned in her eyes slowly fade. And the worst part was that Lila didn't know how to fight it. She was powerless against a system that seemed to have all the authority, all the control. The HOA had become the judge, jury, and executioner in their lives, and every word they spoke felt like a hammer striking against their fragile existence. It was the morning when everything changed, the day when the breaking point came. Lila had decided enough was enough. She wasn't going to let her daughter live in fear anymore. She wasn't going to allow the HOA to dictate their happiness. She had no idea what she was going to do, but she knew one thing: this couldn't go on. They couldn't continue to shrink in the shadows of their own home. They couldn't let Karen, or was it Linda, win. It was early when Lila stepped outside to find Sarah, or maybe Emily, sitting on the porch, looking out at the empty street. The silence between them was deafening. "Sarah," Lila said softly, sitting beside her daughter, "I'm so sorry. I should have done something sooner." But Sarah, no, it was Emily, or maybe it was Rebecca, didn't respond. She just stared ahead, her lips parted but her voice silent. She had lost her fight, the fight to stay strong, to sing without fear. And in that silence, Lila knew they were both losing. But Lila was done. She wasn't going to sit by any longer. The HOA had taken enough. Karen, or maybe Linda, had taken enough. They had taken her daughter's voice, her spirit, and now they were threatening to take everything they had left. That's when the door slammed. Lila turned just in time to see Karen or Linda or whoever it was marching across the yard, clipboard in hand. She was ready, prepared for another round of complaints, another warning, another threat. But this time, Lila wasn't afraid. She wasn't going to let it happen anymore. "Karen," Lila said, her voice steady and unshaken, "this is where it ends." But Karen, or maybe Linda, wasn't interested in words anymore. Without warning, she stepped forward, her hands clutching something cold, something metallic. Lila's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a clipboard anymore. It was a gun. Lila froze. The world seemed to stop. The air thickened, pressing in on her chest, suffocating her. The neighborhood was no longer a place of quiet homes and peaceful lives. It had become a battleground. The lines had been drawn, and this was no longer a fight about singing or noise. This was about something darker. This was about power, control. Karen, or maybe Linda, lifted the gun, her eyes wild, her voice trembling with a fury that was years in the making. "You think you can defy me?" she screamed, her voice cracking with rage. "You think you can keep doing this, keep making noise? Well, I'll show you what happens when you break the rules." Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity. Lila couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. And then, without warning, the gun went off. The world shattered. The bullet hit Sarah, or was it Rebecca, in the chest, and everything else faded away. The sound of the shot was deafening, as though the world had exploded. Lila's scream was swallowed by the noise, her mind failing to comprehend what had just happened. Sarah, or maybe Emily, fell, her body crumpling to the ground like a rag doll. The world around her went into chaos, the neighbors rushing forward, but all Lila could hear was the silence that followed. It wasn't just the song that had been silenced. It was everything. And as Lila dropped to her knees, her heart torn in two, she realized with horrifying clarity that the fight had just begun. But this wasn't the kind of fight that could be won with words. This was a fight for survival. The sirens cut through the morning air like blades, shrill and unrelenting. Neighbors stood frozen in their driveways, some clutching phones, others simply covering their mouths in shock. The cul-de-sac, once the picture of suburban calm, now looked like a war zone. On the driveway lay Sarah, no, perhaps it was Emily, or maybe Rebecca, bleeding into the cracks of the concrete, her chest rising and falling in desperate, shallow gasps. Lila pressed her trembling hands against the wound, her cries raw and jagged. The ambulance arrived, paramedics rushing out with stretchers and medical bags. One of them knelt by the girl's side, barking rapid instructions as another worked to stabilize her. "We've got a pulse," one shouted, Though the words did little to calm the storm raging inside Lila's chest, every second felt like an eternity. Every breath, her daughter took a fragile thread holding her life in balance. The police followed close behind, their cruisers pulling in with flashing lights that painted the neighborhood red and blue. Officers rushed toward the house across the street where Karen or Linda, or perhaps Deborah, stood on her porch, still clutching the gun. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a strange mixture of fury and satisfaction, as though she had proven a point only she could understand. "Drop the weapon," an officer shouted, his gun raised. For a moment, Karen, or was it Cheryl, hesitated, her hand trembling as though she was debating whether to fight or surrender. Finally, the weapon clattered to the porch, the sound echoing across the silent street. The officers swarmed her, forcing her to the ground, cuffing her hands behind her back. But even as they dragged her away, she didn't stop speaking. "They don't follow the rules," she muttered over and over, her voice a bitter chant. "They don't follow the rules, and this is what happens. Order must be kept." Lila heard those words, each one piercing her heart like a blade. She wanted to scream at her, to demand how anyone could justify such horror. But her voice was caught in her throat, choked by grief and rage. All she could do was watch as the woman was shoved into the back of a patrol car, her eyes still blazing with a twisted sense of righteousness. At the hospital, time lost meaning. Hours blurred together, filled with the sterile smell of antiseptic and the sound of monitors beeping steadily. Doctors worked tirelessly, their expressions grim but determined. Lila and her husband sat in the waiting room, hands clasped together so tightly their knuckles turned white. Every passing minute felt like a verdict, as though fate was weighing their daughter's life on a scale they couldn't see. Meanwhile, news of the shooting spread like wildfire. Local media descended on the neighborhood, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward as they tried to capture the story. Headlines screamed about the tragedy. HOA dispute turns violent. Teen girl shot for singing too loudly. Community in shock. But what tore Lila apart more than anything was the division within the community itself. Some neighbors rallied behind her family, furious that anyone could take something so trivial and twist it into violence. They spoke of Sarah's innocence, her kindness, her gift of song that had once brought joy to all of them. Yet others defended Karen, Linda, Deborah. They claimed she had been pushed too far, that the constant singing was unbearable, that rules existed for a reason. If they had just listened, none of this would have happened. One neighbor said in an interview, their words slicing into Lila like shards of glass. The trial that followed only deepened the wounds. In the courtroom, Karen's defense painted her as a woman overwhelmed, tormented by the constant noise, driven to madness by the refusal of her neighbors to obey the rules. They argued she was not a criminal, but a victim of circumstance, a person who had snapped. But the prosecution told a different story, one of obsession, control, and malice. They detailed the endless complaints, the threats, the moments where Karen, Linda, Rebecca had stood outside, glaring at the girl with hatred in her eyes. They showed the jury the letters, the recordings, the witness testimonies that painted a picture of someone who wasn't pushed to the edge, but who had willingly stepped over it. Lila sat in the courtroom each day, her hands shaking as she listened. She heard her daughter's name spoken again and again, though it seemed to change every time. Sometimes Emily, sometimes Sarah, sometimes Rebecca. The confusion mirrored the chaos of that day, the way trauma twisted memory into fragments. Yet the essence remained, a young girl silenced for daring to sing. Her daughter's recovery was slow, painful, uncertain. She survived, but the scars ran deep, on her body, yes, but also on her spirit. The songs that once flowed so freely now caught in her throat. Hospitals and courtrooms replaced porches and playgrounds. She was alive, but the innocence had been stripped away, replaced by fear, by questions no child should ever have to ask. And through it all, the question remained, would justice truly be served? Could there ever be justice for something so senseless, so cruel? The fight was no longer about singing. It was about dignity, about proving that a child's voice mattered more than an HOA's obsession with silence. It was about showing the world that their daughter's life had value, that no rule, no complaint, no neighborhood politics could justify the violence that had nearly stolen her away. In the eyes of the law, Karen or Linda or Deborah would face the consequences of her actions. But for Lila and her family, the real battle was only beginning. The battle to reclaim their daughter's voice, to heal wounds that went far deeper than the skin, and to remind the world that no song should ever end in silence. The trial was over, but the true aftermath had only just begun. The courtroom had been the battlefield, the place where justice had been sought. But in the quiet corners of Lila's home, away from the flashing cameras and constant chatter of the media, it was a different kind of war, a fight for survival. Sarah, or maybe it was Emily or perhaps Rebecca, was still recovering. Physically, the doctors had done their part, stitching the wound that had nearly claimed her life. But emotionally, the damage was far more complicated. Each day felt like a struggle to reclaim a piece of the life she had lost, her voice, her confidence, her trust in the world. The doctors were cautiously optimistic. "She's a fighter," they told Lila and her husband. But no one could promise how long it would take to heal, or if Sarah, or maybe it was Emily, would ever truly feel whole again. The sounds that once filled the house, laughter, music, joy, had been replaced by silence. The air felt heavier, thicker with unspoken grief. Lila spent her days watching Sarah, or was it Emily, closely, her heart aching with every glance. She had always been so full of life, so vibrant and full of promise. And now, each time Lila looked at her daughter, she saw that spark, once so bright, flickering weakly, struggling to stay alive. Sarah, or maybe Rebecca, would sit in the corner, her fingers trembling as she traced the edge of a book, but she never opened it. Her guitar, once her constant companion, sat untouched in the corner of her room, gathering dust. The neighbors had changed, too. The ones who once greeted Lila with smiles now avoided her eyes, as if her family had become a symbol of something uncomfortable, something they didn't want to face. It was as though the walls between them had grown taller, thicker after the shooting. The very thing that had once bound them together, community, neighborhood, shared experiences, had now torn them apart. Some of the neighbors had tried to reach out, offering condolences, but their words always felt hollow. It wasn't their fault, they had seen what had happened too, but the truth was, the damage ran deeper than any kind of apology could fix. What had happened that day wasn't just about Karen or Linda or whoever she was. It wasn't even about the gunshot. It was about the way something as simple as singing, something so pure, so innocent, had been twisted into an excuse for violence. The media never stopped coming. At first, it was a trickle, a few news outlets trying to capture the raw emotion of a tragedy. But soon it became a flood. Camera crews camped out on the street, their lenses focused on the house, on the family, on Sarah, or maybe Emily, who had now become an unwilling symbol of suburban strife. The question everyone seemed to ask was the same. How did something so trivial, so small, become the catalyst for such a horrific event? The answer wasn't simple. It wasn't about the noise, the singing, or the HOA rules. It was about something far darker, an obsession with control, a refusal to allow any kind of individuality, any kind of freedom to exist outside the boundaries they set. Lila had spent hours, days, weeks trying to make sense of it all. She kept replaying the moments, the sound of the gunshot, the look in Sarah's, or maybe it was Rebecca's, eyes as she fell to the ground, the words Karen or Linda had said before everything spiraled out of control. But nothing made sense. How could someone so consumed by rules, so desperate for order, take another person's life in the name of silence? It took weeks for Sarah, or perhaps Emily, to speak again. Her voice, when it finally came, was so quiet, so fragile, that it broke Lila's heart all over again. It wasn't the same voice that had once filled the house with song. It was hesitant, unsure. It cracked and faltered as Sarah, or maybe it was Rebecca, tried to speak. But when she did, Lila saw it. That spark, that faint, glimmer of hope beginning to return. "I want to sing again, Sarah," or Emily whispered, the words trembling in the air. Lila's heart swelled with both joy and fear. Could she? Could her daughter really find the strength to reclaim what had been stolen from her? But it wasn't going to be easy. The road ahead was long, and Lila knew that healing, true healing, would take more than time. It would take effort. It would take patience. And it would take a community of support, one that had to rebuild itself from the ashes of what had been broken. The weeks turned into months, and slowly, Sarah, or maybe Rebecca, began to sing again. It started soft, a whisper of a melody in the privacy of a room. But it was a start. It was the first step toward reclaiming what had been taken from her. Lila watched from the doorway, her heart both full and heavy. She could hear her daughter's voice rise once more, each note stronger, more confident than the last. It wasn't the same as before. It was different. It was harder earned, scarred by the wounds of the past, but it was still beautiful. It was still Sarah. And as the song filled the house once more, Lila knew that the fight for her daughter's voice was far from over. It would never truly end. But she would be there, always fighting beside her, helping her find her way back to the light. Because in the end, no rule, no threat, no HOA could ever silence the heart of a child, no matter how hard they tried. If you believe in the power of justice, in standing up for what's right, no matter how small the battle seems, then this story is just the beginning. Subscribe to HOA Denied Access to stay updated on more real stories that demand to be heard. Let's continue fighting for what's ours, for the voices that have been silenced, and for the truth that needs to be told. Don't forget to like, comment, and share, because together we make sure no voice goes unheard.